So for me, if right now immigration reform is not passing because they can't agree on that border, please, for the love of God, agree on the border. Let's agree on whatever border you want to put in front of anybody. My question to you is this: has humanity ever built a border that could withstand human will?
Hi, I'm Reihan Salam, and this is the Vice Podcast Show. I'm joined today by Jose Antonio Vargas, writer and director of Documented.
Jose Antonio Vargas of the Washington Post.
Jose Antonio Vargas is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist.
I lived the American dream, building a successful career as a journalist. But I was living a lie. I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told a lot of people. I'm actually an undocumented immigrant. Immigration is stories, so here's my story. My grandparents legally immigrated from the Philippines in the mid-1980s. My grandfather decided that he was going to get his grandson to come to America. One morning, my suitcase was packed. I was 12. It's been 18 years since I've seen my mother. So I'm launching a whole campaign about what it means to be an American and the fact that I am an American. There are 11 million undocumented people in this country. In 2010, undocumented people paid $11.2 billion in state and local taxes.
My name is Erika Andiola. I'm from Colombia.
From Nigeria.
From Brazil.
I'm an undocumented immigrant from Germany.
We mow your lawn. We work at your houses. Maybe we're your doctors. Maybe we're nurses. We're not who you think we are.
People who have come here illegally should not be citizens of the United States.
So what happens in Iowa if you discover as a cop that somebody's an undocumented person?
I'm looking for freedom.
A major blow for immigration reform today. The Senate voted against the DREAM Act.
I'm a conservative and I'm a hardcore Republican, but I don't agree with them on this.
You're an illegal alien.
No, I'm an undocumented immigrant.
No, you're an illegal.
Wait, no, actually, this is...
I think I've broken a law just having you in my studio.
Who is really the Americans? I would say people came here to do good for this country.
We dream of a path to citizenship. We dream of contributing to the country we call our home. I have this fantasy that I get a green card and I fly, and that my mother would be there waiting for me.
I'm looking for freedom.
Jose, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So tell me, what is Documented about?
So I'm proud to say that Documented is the first film to be written and directed by an actual undocumented person. So there was 11 million of us in this country, and one of them made the film. And I wanted to chronicle whatever this experience was that I was going to go through.
What does it mean to be undocumented exactly?
Well, I mean, to be undocumented, I think people, that's a really good question. I think people have to realize that to be undocumented means to obsess over pieces of documents. So there are, the only document
people use is unauthorized. So the idea is
unauthorized,
that there are people who are lawful immigrants, and then there are those who are
here illegally, who are here without authorization, who are here illegally. So I'm one of those people. And I don't have the only piece of ID right now that I use, like I've been flying around like crazy around the country. So the only piece of ID I use is a Filipino passport. So, I just arrived from JFK this morning, and that's the passport that I show to get on the plane. But that's the only ID I have. New York, for example, state doesn't give licenses, driver's licenses to undocumented people, although the speaker of the city council actually just introduced municipal ID. So hopefully that would, in New York City alone, there's 500,000 undocumented
So you
people.
haven't always been so vocal about the issues facing unauthorized immigrants.
No.
And that's part of what the film is about, right?
Well, it's kind of, my cowardice, I guess is what you could call it. So I was born in the Philippines, got here when I was 12, found out that I was undocumented when I was 16, and then a year later discovered journalism. And the only reason I did that was because my name would be on a piece of paper. I thought, hey, that seems like a good way to exist. And so I just kind of kept writing. I spent 13 years just writing news articles for.
So you wanted recognition. You wanted to feel
I
like
don't
you were
think
more
I don't
solidly.
think recognition really. I think it's more the fact like to say on a piece of paper that I can touch that I'm here as proof of existence, right? Recognition would be like, okay, recognize me and then arrest me and deport me. So that I never really wanted that, which is why it's ironic what's happened.
But you wound up having a really brilliant career as a journalist.
Considering the circumstances, yes. Considering the circumstances, I remember when I was at the Washington Post when the foreign editor took me out to lunch and he said, we want you to go to Iraq to like write your Jose stories, because I used to write these like stories about culture and technology, and I remember going to the bathroom and like trying to figure out, what do I tell him, you know? I went back to the lunch and I said, you know, I grew up overseas, like I don't really want to see the world. And he looked at me and he was like, what are you talking about? And then he said, to matter at the Washington Post newsroom, you had two things, a foreign correspondent or a political reporter. And I said, I'll be a political reporter. And he was like, you're 24. No, you won't be. But I did. 2 years later, I was a political reporter. So those are just the kind of maneuvering.
Yeah.
You can call it manipulation. You can call it, you know, I had to survive, right? And every undocumented person has to figure that out.
So that just dread, that anxiety hanging over you forced you and in some ways shaped your personality and the way that you approached the entire
and I
world.
mean, it's really been fascinating showing, or like my 6th grade, 7th grade friends seeing the film, because one of them said to me at one point, it's like I'm meeting you for the first time.
Do you feel like you make more sense to people in your life when they know those pressures that you were facing and about how those pressures might have shaped how you interacted with people?
Yes. I think that's been, I have to say, the most surreal part of this whole process for me. You know, again, this is not the film I wanted to make, but in some ways it's the film that I needed to make. And sometimes it feels a little, it's surreal.
The way that, you know, you talk about having, at one point, we'll talk more about this, having come out of the closet as an undocumented person. And it sounds like a lot of the pressures you're talking about are things that people associate with people who come out of the closet as gay, let's say. You know, people who are facing all kinds of pressures, you know, that make it very difficult for them to interact with people in a kind of natural way. So, I mean, I found that
the intersection there is, again, like I had come out of 2 closets in my life and I'm totally done. Like, I have nothing more to share with you. So the first time was, you know, coming out as gay. I was in high school. I was 18. And for me, that was easier, just because I grew up in kind of the Bay Area near San Francisco, and it was much easier to come out of that closet than it was to come out of this one. And I actually did it in a pretty public way. I did it during like history class while we were watching, after we watched this great documentary called The Life and Times of Harvey Milk. So that's when I raised my hand in the class and say, I'm gay.
So what was the impetus to come out of this other closet? Because you did it in a very public way. You did it in an op-ed piece.
I did it in
was
like
widely
a
read.
4,000 word confessional. I didn't even call it an op-ed piece. In my mind, one of my lawyers, because you know I have a lot of lawyers who looked at the piece and they said, "Are you crazy? Like you can't publish this piece." One of them said it was like legal suicide.
So if you're writing a 4,000 word piece, this was not a decision made on a whim.
Oh,
this
no.
was a decision, I mean, this was very deliberate and you knew the repercussions.
No, I'm not, you know, I would like to think that I'm a pretty thoughtful person. You know, I thought this all the way through. I knew what I was getting myself into. But what I wasn't prepared for, frankly, was the silence from the government. That I wasn't prepared for. My name is Jose Antonio Vargas. Last summer, I wrote this kind of big essay for the New York Times magazine, like coming out, basically, as undocumented. And I haven't heard from anybody. So I'm calling you guys to get some information on kind of what my status is. No, I don't have an alien number. I mean, yeah, I'm undocumented. I don't have, you know, I don't. Are you planning on deporting me? Why or why? I mean, again, like, are you planning on deporting me? Why or why not? And okay, so I'll put that in the email. And then how do you decide whether to start deportation proceedings against somebody? You know?
What was the precipitating thing? Was there a moment when you were just reading the news observing this debate, and then it just occurred to you, I've got to actually do this?
No, it was a collection of moments. I mean, for me, I think it started when, I was a political reporter and I was covering my first presidential campaign. I was covering John Edwards, Obama, Hillary Clinton. I was like running around the country covering the election as an undocumented person. And it was just so, how could I have not said anything, right? Like, there were so many moments in the campaign when Mike Huckabee was talking about immigration that I could have easily raised my hand up and said, Governor. So that was when it started. But for me, a real moment was when I was profiling.
It certainly was affecting your ability to be objective in covering these guys, right?
Well, but objectivity doesn't exist.
That's a good point.
It does not exist. I mean, in many ways, I think it's the province, frankly, for me, it's a province of mostly white male editors who still run newsrooms who think that things can be objective when they cannot.
So you were saying that because they have this privilege, because they have the security, they think one can be.
Because they're the default, right? Like everything else must be explained.
You'll acknowledge that you had a point of view that was necessarily going to shape how you cover these
But
guys.
everybody has a point of view.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that is like, I really hope that that's something that newsrooms can like talk about more openly, right?
Yeah.
So I was covering the election, and then a moment came when I ended up profiling Mark Zuckerberg for the New Yorker. I mean, for me that was, as any writer will tell you, like getting published in the New Yorker is like, I really wanted that, and I was interviewing Mark, and at one point, Mark, who's a really friendly guy, he's not like that dude from the movie, the Social Network. At one point, Mark turns to me and says, like, where are you from, Jose? Very simple question. And I just looked at him and glared at him. And I think that's when I kind of knew that I was like done. Like I was just, and around that time, the DREAM Act was really, in the papers, and the Senate vote was about to happen. The House passed it. The Senate was about to figure out what to do with it. So,
can you tell us about the DREAM Act for those who don't know?
So the DREAM Act was actually introduced in August 2001, a month before 9/11 hit. And the DREAM Act would provide a path to not only legalization but citizenship to young undocumented people who were basically raised in this country, right? Who grew up here, who went to school here, who call this country their home. So that's what the DREAM Act is.
And part of the premise is that these are people who did not intentionally violate U.S. immigration laws. They were brought by their parents. So part of the premise of the DREAM Act is that these are innocents, quote unquote.
Which is, I've heard,
that's a fair characterization.
That's a fair, but I've heard so many politicians say, you can't blame these kids for the mistakes of their parents. And I always push back and I say, I'm sorry, what was the mistake? What was the mistake of the Irish when,
We'll revisit that. But first, so you were, the discussion of the DREAM Act, so you were giving us a little bit of background.
So the DREAM Act failed the Senate in December 2011, and then that's when I really was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm really gonna do this. And then basically prepared 4 or 5 months. I was about to turn 30, and 30 was, I think for anybody is like a big year, right? And so I threw myself an I might get deported party, and I invited all of my close friends, and they kind of flew all to San Francisco, and I told them I'm about to do this. We don't know what's gonna happen, but hey, here's some Indian food. It was.
And these were all friends who already knew about your predicament?
No, I started coming out to more and more people just to prepare them, because I really didn't tell a lot of people. And frankly, I was surprised that I kept the secret for as long as I did. So prepare people. And so I thought this through. I thought through how I was going to come out initially. What I did not fully thought through was the film. I knew that I wanted to film. I knew that I was, going to do something around the DREAM Act.
And you'd already worked on a film before, so
I worked on a film before. I know the language. I'm relatively inexperienced at it, but I knew what I wanted to do, right? And I'm kind of, as any immigrant will tell you, like we learn about America by watching television and movies. And, I think by the time I was in 8th grade, I'd watch every like Sidney Lumet film ever made, like just kind of a cinephile in that way. I knew I wanted to do a film. I just wasn't sure what it was going to be, and it definitely changed.
So, you've become one of the most notable activists around issues surrounding unauthorized immigrants, dreamers, and what have you. And of course, this film is going to be very much a part of that. And do you ever miss that work that you were able to do before? I mean, just do you ever kind of feel as though this stuff has taken over your life, and you'd prefer?
That's an interesting question. What I find really fascinating is how it seems as if my journalistic ID or card just got taken away. It's like, here, no more, right? Like,
now that
you're
an
not
advocate,
a journalist.
Yeah.
And then the question for me becomes, well, what do you think I'm advocating for?
Yeah.
I'm advocating to be you. I'm advocating to have the freedom that you have. So I guess you can call that advocacy. I guess you call that activism. But then if that is the case, then why aren't we all advocates and activists? Like, what is really the role of journalism, right? I mean, of course, as somebody who used to cover cops and school board meetings and, city hall beat, like, they're just the facts. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going on. That.
So part of what you're saying is that, look, objectivity, there's this fantasy of objectivity.
Oh, yeah.
That's a fantasy that is a fantasy of privileged people who are secure. And
privilege is, privilege is a heady word. It's a complicated thing. I guess what I'm saying is,
well, because we're all privileged and not privileged in different kinds of ways.
But who gets to tell whose story, right? And why is somebody's advocacy someone's, why is it that things get called analysis and other things get called agendas?
So I want to talk to you a little bit. I interrupted you before when you were talking about the thesis behind the DREAM Act, but I want to talk to you a little bit about that because, my understanding and the way that I think about this as a question of advocacy is that, look, when you're engaging in a campaign of advocacy, you have to think about it strategically.
Yeah, of course.
And you kind of move by stages. And if you look at some of the political movements that have been very successful in changing people's minds, one way they do that is by leveraging the fact that people who are in position X or Y.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So not a lot of middle-class Americans know people who've been incarcerated.
Yeah.
So that makes it really hard to get people to focus on criminal justice issues and the way the criminal justice system really harms people's lives. You could say that part of what you've done is said, wait a second, there are a lot of unauthorized immigrants. You might know some of them. They might be a part of your life, and that can be a very powerful tool. But so when you look at the politics of the DREAM Act, I've always been fascinated by it because it's kind of saying that, okay, well, if you speak English really well, and if you go to community college or if you've served in the military, well, then you're one of the good guys, and then we're going to give you a path to citizenship. And it seems like you're skeptical about that.
It's a very dangerous paradigm to say, oh, look at the model immigrant.
But then before we go into why it's a dangerous paradigm, but it's kind of obvious why people would start there, right?
Of course. I mean, that's completely natural. But again, it robs people of humanity. It's to say that, okay, let's save the ones who speak English well and are acceptable and are quote-unquote American, and screw the other ones.
Okay, but see, here's what I find frustrating about the debate around the DREAM Act, because I think that actually most people who share your view that we need to do something about the status of unauthorized immigrants, et cetera, I think a lot of them share your view of the DREAM Act too. They don't actually buy the idea that there's that big a difference between someone who went to community college and someone who didn't, right? So then it just seems kind of transparently manipulative, right? So we're going to try to win over some people who buy into this idea, and then once you do that, well, then you say, well, gosh, you can't break up people's families. Because these kids did it through no fault of their own, but then, well, you can't deport their parents now. See what I mean?
I think the point here, it's really interesting to me because when I outed myself, I wrote about the DREAM Act, but I never said that I was only advocating for the DREAM Act. The press made that assumption. Right? The press was the one, every article that was written, Jose Vargas, DREAM Act. I'm one of the what they call elder dreamers. Because when I went to high school, there was no DREAM Act. Right? The DREAM Act in many ways is a millennial thing. I'm 33 and I think I'm kind of at the edge, at the outskirts of that.
You and I are both so old that we're on the verge of death, essentially.
No, but the DREAM Act is only one slice of a very complicated pie. Right? And that's why, as of course I support the DREAM Act. Right now there are 4 states in America, Alabama, Arizona, Montana, and Georgia, that don't allow undocumented high school graduates to go to college in America in 2014 in the Obama era, right? We should all be for that, but that's only one slice of the pie.
See, one way of putting it is that it's really complicated. Another way of putting it is that it's actually not complicated at all. It sounds as though you think that anyone who is unauthorized, with the exception of people who have committed crimes,
crimes,
something
yep.
along those lines, that they should be they should be granted legal status. Is
They
that
should be
fair to
granted
say?
some sort of. The number one question I get asked two questions as I travel around the country. I mean, I've done 200 events in 42 states in 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Number one, why haven't they deported you? I have no idea. I've called them myself. They didn't give me an answer. You ask them. Number two, why don't you just make yourself legal? And to me, that's a really interesting, troubling question because it kind of you can almost squarely land at in the lap of the American press and say, see, this is the consequence of all the misinformation out there, right? Immigration code is more complicated than the tax code.
And it's extremely hard to get legal, right?
Yeah, but the fact
legal,
that people think that I can just get in the corner of 14th and 6th, get in an office, right, and fill out a form.
Yeah.
People think that that's what people like me have to do.
Yeah.
The fact that people don't even know there's a process is such a failure of enormous magnitude.
I agree with you. I mean, I do think that one question that comes up, and actually this did come up in the film too, I think is a really interesting and important one. So as you know, as someone who's studied the ins and outs of immigration policy.
Because I live it.
Because you live it, yeah. So there's one little piece. So, most of the people who come to the country legally come in through family sponsorship. Yeah. There's some chunk of people who come in on an employer basis for a kind of economic reasons. There are people who become lawful permanent residents. There's about 1 million a year. Then there's another 300,000 people who come in temporarily. Yep. Some of those people who are here temporarily get permanent legal status. And then there's, the number varies, but some estimates are that you've got about 500,000 people who come in as unauthorized immigrants, overstaying visas or crossing the border, et cetera. There's one little program, which we might get rid of, the diversity visa lottery, where you've got 50,000 people, 50,000 slots. And I was really surprised to see the number. Okay, so the idea is that if you have more than a high school education, you can apply for one of these slots. And it's amazing. In 2011, 1.36 million Nigerians applied. Well, it's actually, I'm sorry, there were 1.36 million applications, and each one of those applications represents a family. Yeah. And then you've got over 900,000 people from Ghana, and you've got 850,000 people from Ukraine, and those numbers change, et cetera. So every one of those applicants represents a family, potentially, right? And I wonder about, that Ukrainian, that Ghanaian person who applied for the diversity visa lottery, didn't get it, and then their kids, they don't get the opportunity to earn that income. Their kids don't get the opportunity to enjoy some of those things that make American life so great. Yeah. And so I wonder about those people. How do we think about them, in the context of what is just?
Well, because right now, if we go by the Senate bill, there would be no diversity lottery. Right?
What I mean is people who are going through the channels that exist right now, right? Because there are people, so there are some people who came, who decided, let me go. There are not a lot of channels for someone who is, let's say, with limited skills or doesn't have relatives or doesn't have those connections. So there are people who tried to go through the legal process and have remained in extremely poor countries.
Yes.
And then there are people who chose not to go through that process and then came to live and work in the United States. So, presumably those people who chose not to enter the country illegally, they love their kids too, right?
Yeah, of course. Well, if Nigeria were in Mexico right now, we would be having a Nigerian problem, not a Mexican problem. If the Philippines were in Mexico right now, there'd be a lot more Filipinos here than they are. It's a matter, of course, of proximity, right?
But you get a lot of people who talk about this debate say, well, wait a second, we think that there are people who've been waiting in line,
yeah, of course.
And then there are other people who are trying to jump the line, right? So
which is why for me it's like, hey, show me the line. If you want me to wait in the back of the line somewhere, tell me, but show me a line. That line doesn't even exist. So my mother, for example, is waiting on 16 years right now to come here. Is that fair? I don't really have a choice. The government says it's 16 years, right?
Is it fair that those guys in Ghana and Ukraine and dozens of other countries, who didn't get that legal opportunity, that they haven't been able to come?
Oh, is it fair for them to not have that opportunity to come?
Yeah.
Well, look, you're talking to somebody who's been subjected to the unfairness of this entire system, right? It wasn't my choice to come here, but my mother sent me here. And for me, the larger question, by the way, that we haven't even gotten to and scraped the surface is, what is really the role of, American foreign policy and economic policies in migration patterns, right? Like, I was in North Carolina recently, and I ended up talking about how there's 4 million Filipinos in America. And this man was clearly belligerent and said to me, why are there so many of you here? It was late, and so I was like, and I just said to him, I'm sorry, sir, we are here because you were there. That's why we're here. And he was like, what? You know, when the Philippines was Puerto Rico, when the Philippines was the first Vietnam and the first Iraq, right? For years, for decades, America has taken advantage of the Philippines.
So you think it's a matter of justice?
Well, I mean, it's not,
with
it's
regard to
about,
Filipinos?
It's not necessarily just, because you can go to Guatemala,
because there are large numbers of Filipinos who work in Hong Kong and Qatar and kind of it's one of the most successful diasporas. Yeah.
The role of American foreign policy and economic policies in migration patterns. That's what I'm talking about.
Well, that's actually a very interesting and distinctive argument, which we don't hear a lot about in the film.
We don't hear
and
about,
doesn't come up a lot in the political debate, right?
It's a 90-minute film, and I could, like, believe me, if I could have talked about the remnants of colonialism and imperialism, I would have. But there was
that's actually very useful to know. So your belief is that one of the reasons why we should have, it sounds like we should have open borders for people who want to come, or at least to people where there's a legacy of colonialism and imperialism. That's
what's lacking in its entire conversation is a sense of intellectual honesty. That's what's lacking, right? So you can't have a conversation about the border, for example, and not admit to the fact that we live in a country that has always been addicted to cheap labor, right? We put a sign up outside the U.S.-Mexico border that says, 10 yards out, keep out. 10 yards in, what do we say? Job, help wanted.
Of course, some of the immigration debate is about changing that, right? I mean, some of the ideas, some of the people who advocate enforcement is that, well, actually, let's move away from this, what some would call an addiction to cheap labor.
I mean, we used to have a Bracero program in this country that no longer exists. I mean, there used to be an actual legal way for that to happen that doesn't exist anymore.
And we also have changes in agriculture and various other sectors where people with limited skills are having a much harder time finding remunerative employment in the United States. And you see this across many different societies, right? So insofar as the United States is an affluent society, but that has many people who suffer from multi-generational entrenched poverty, if you have limited resources to tackle those problems, some would argue that, well, gosh, let's look at people who've been here, who are the multi-generational American poor, of Mexican origin, who are the descendants of sharecroppers and slaves. Maybe we need to focus those resources on that population rather than on people from other countries who are very poor.
I mean, what we're kind of dancing around here is how do you build a 21st century immigration model for a country that was built by immigrants, right? Is it the question, for example, you're bringing up the whole lottery situation, right? Is it fair that there's, only a small number of visas available for families who want to come here, while people from the Philippines, because if you look at the actual numbers of people, so 1 out of 5 Koreans is undocumented, 1 out of 6 Filipinos are undocumented, and you just look at who's here illegally without authorization, right? And you compare that with, say, I don't know what the number of Ukrainian is or Nigerian, so that I'm sure there's many. That's a really, really interesting question. And we can't even get to those questions and really figure out what we want to be because we're stuck and completely obsessed with this border in our minds.
I guess I think that the fairness question, and I suppose you just disagree with me on this, but I do think that it's a really interesting fairness question to ask about what we do on behalf of those people who applied and who didn't get authorized status versus people who chose to enter the country unauthorized, because access to the U.S. labor market, just like access to the labor market in Qatar, just like access to the labor market in Singapore, that's a very valuable thing. So people who spent 10 years, not taking advantage of that access to the labor market, right? They made a big sacrifice because they wanted to do it the legal way.
But I think we're talking about the system. Like, we're saying, okay, I agree that if a family in Nigeria or Ukraine wants to come here and they've applied to come here, right? And then they don't get it. If you want me to wait in the back of the line from them, yes, I'll do that. I agree on that. I'm not saying that I leapfrog in front of people because I didn't do it, quote unquote, the right legal way, right? So if you want to, if that's what we're talking about, then yes, I agree. You and I agree on that I would be waiting, people like me would wait on the back of the people who have legally waited in line. Now, a separate argument is, what is a 21st century immigration model for this country? And at a time when, if capital, and again, I don't want to get into this whole border.
If capital is going to be mobile, then labor ought to but to me, it's like, it's an interesting view.
Well, but I mean, again, this
not
is
widely held by many other.
Well, but having come from, again, when you connect the economic dots, right? Because a lot of this is about following the money. So for me, if right now immigration reform is not passing because they can't agree on that border, please, for the love of God, agree on the border. Let's agree on whatever border you want to put in front of anybody. My question to you is this: Has humanity ever built a border that could withstand human will?
This is a wonderful, please
When
continue.
the Irish were hungry,
Yeah.
right? They didn't care for a border. They got on boats after the 1850s potato famine, and they landed on Ellis Island without papers.
Right. So this is the question. I think that when you're talking about a 21st century immigration policy, it's not just the United States that has this dilemma,
Oh, no,
right?
it's not.
If you're
It's
looking
not.
at Canada, Australia,
Look
there are a
at
wide
Europe.
range
Look
of
at
other
all of
countries,
Europe.
a wide range of other countries that have pioneered different strategies.
Yes.
Some of which are arguably, some of which have arguably been more successful than the U.S. strategy. And I guess, one view that a lot of people have is that, given that you have this number of this entrenched multi-generational poverty in this country, given that you have a changing economy that's going to make it a lot more challenging for some people to flourish in a society like this one, maybe it's appropriate to kind of rethink our immigration policy, in ways that are not going to create opportunities for, kind of lots of people with limited skills to.
I mean, it's not only appropriate, it's like, it's necessary. I think it's an imperative, right? I mean, I think if we are really going to be the multicultural global superpower that we claim to be, I mean, if you look at just the demographic patterns, right, like of the fact that we are trying to still be young and dynamic. I mean, look at Japan, for example. That's a perfect example of what happens when you close your system off from the rest of the world, right?
But again, Australia and Canada are a somewhat different example, right? And they actually, tend to bias their immigration policies in terms of towards skilled immigrants,
Yes.
very, very aggressively. And I think that that is a tough conceptual question, right?
But then it becomes a question of who gets to. I mean, as you know, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act changed everything. Are you familiar with that?
I am.
Okay, so that's why people like me, that's why my grandparents got here legally, and that's why I'm here now illegally, was because of that, right? And that act said that it wasn't just about skills, it was family unification, right? And that's why the country right now looks the way that it does. And I think it's important that we keep that. Do we only want an economic model? I don't know. I mean, frankly, I have
Well, you're
been,
asserting that it's important to keep that. And again, this
Yes,
is a
I
real
think
debate.
I mean, I think it is important. But the thing is, I guess I've so grown accustomed to debates that I'm just really tired of them. I feel like what I would rather, as I said, what I would rather have is an actual intellectually honest conversation. I think that's what I'm really trying to go for, right? And when I go to places with this film, for example, it's been very interesting because making the choice of making it so personal, which was hard for me to do, and I'm sure it was really difficult for my mother, it's been effective because after Republicans and conservatives, for example, see the film, I just showed the film at Miami University where Paul Ryan went to school, Speaker Boehner's district, around Speaker Boehner's district. A young woman came up to me and said, my whole life, I just never thought about this issue like this. It was about, criminals and you taking stuff away from us. Like it wasn't about a mom and a kid. It wasn't. So for me, that's been really gratifying to hear that from people, right? All of a sudden the conversation becomes, what wouldn't a mother do for his child or for her, or his child? I think that's what I know that's, look, I can debate with you or with anybody else about the intellectual, economic merits of this argument. We can go to town with that till the beginning of
Or if colonialism and imperialism should shape our immigration policy.
I've read Howard Zinn. I get all of that. But at the end of the day, this is what we have in this country is a moral crisis, right? The New York Times reported that President Obama and of course with the Republican House of Representatives have deported about 2 million people in 5 years. 2/3 of those deportations.
Any immigration policy require deportations if you have any rules regarding who is going to be allowed to settle in the United States or not?
Well, but
isn't that the case?
Well, but it changed after Bill Clinton in terms of like actually removing the thing that's.
But if you're going to have immigration laws of any kind,
yes,
and you're going to enforce those laws, that's going to mean deportations, and it's going to mean deportations of people who have wonderful, compelling stories, right?
Yeah, but deportations of people then who have American citizen family members, right? So we have a situation right now in America, for example, where 5,000 kids, right, who are American citizens are foster kids because both parents have gotten deported. So is that a fair deportation policy? Well, I'm asking you that question. Is that fair?
Well, I guess the real question is, inevitably when you have a law, there are going to be tragic consequences of any law, right? They're always going to be.
We can talk about Loving versus Virginia. We can talk about, Jim Crow laws. We can talk about unjust
So
laws
you
in this
believe that
country to the end of time.
immigration laws are necessarily the equivalent of
No,
loving?
what I agree is that laws need and must change and must update and must, in many ways adapt to the reality, to the shifting reality of the issue. Now, do I believe that a country has a right to put borders on it? Yes. Do I agree that if criminals who've committed serious crimes should be deported and gotten out of this country? Yes. Do I agree?
It should just be criminals.
But wait a second. Am I going to agree that a person who's making $5 an hour, who's being underpaid as an undocumented migrant farm worker, who has, a 5-year-old kid, to be separated from his American-born child, that's un-American to me? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess.
Or would the law, because it is the law, would the law just say, okay, screw that. Let's separate that kid from, her dad.
I guess another view is that, as you said, if Nigeria were next to the United States, they'd be in a very different position, right?
Yes.
And I guess I don't see that Nigerian parent as being any worse than the Mexican parent who decided to cross the border, right? So then
Wait. What do you mean any worse? What does that mean?
Well, what I mean is that they're morally identical, and yet we've created a situation, if you say that by virtue of having crossed the border and having had a child in the United States, you were going to have a different position than the Nigerian who applied and then wasn't able to come, right?
I'm sorry, I think you're making... My point is, no matter if it's Mexican or Nigerian or Filipino,
because one place is closer to the United States, it's a little bit easier to cross the border, right?
Yes, yes.
And if you have resources, it's a lot easier too.
But my point is, people have been coming to this country before there were any laws, before there were any restrictions. Is the matter of the restrictions now because the demographics are different? Now, I have traveled, I don't know how much you've traveled the country in terms of talking about this issue, but I've done a lot of that in the past 3 years. And there's a sense that this country is changing too much, right? Like you have places in the South and the Midwest that didn't used to have Latino or Asian populations that are now seeing dramatic, like 100% growth, right? And there's a feeling of, wait a second, like they're not supposed to be.
So you think that, but you think that it's only racism that's behind
wait.
skepticism?
You called it racism. I didn't.
Okay.
Let me be
sorry.
very clear
Anxiety
about that.
about demographic change.
Racism is something that we have to be very careful
Okay, no,
about.
absolutely. So you think that but you don't think that it's only anxiety about demographic change, do you?
I think it's anxiety over demographic change. I think it's anxiety about economic, right? The fact that people feel that they're not getting, people want someone to blame, right? The economy sucks. I can't send my kid to school. I'm not earning the kind of money that I want to earn.
You don't think it could just be that people think that Canada and Australia have pretty good policies and maybe we can learn from them?
Now, I'm not sure if people actually, the fact that people don't even know what American policy is, I'm not going to bet that they would know what the Canadian and Australian policy is.
So it's just ignorance.
Oh, I think a lot of it, ignorance is, people don't wake up every day thinking about me. They wake up thinking every day about themselves, right? So it's my job, it's our job to kind of collectively, individually say, look, like this is how it works, right? And I don't know, is this fair to you or not? And that's, I don't know, as you saw in the film, like that's what I've been kind of trying to do.
So what are your hopes for the film? What is your highest goal, your
My
aspiration?
hope for the film is that it, to me, in this country, right, immigration has always been about families, what we do for our families so that we can build better lives for ourselves, right? And my hope for the film, and this is why I decided to make it as personal as I did, is to make it squarely about that. And get it out of this kind of political ghetto, this kind of US-Mexico border illegal criminal ghetto that we put it in. And frankly, I think that's our job as storytellers and as journalists. Now, it's important that we ask hard questions, but I think it's really important that we contextualize it in the most humane ways we can, right? To me, in this country, it's been really fascinating studying kind of the immigration law, right? In terms of like the very first people that got excluded were the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And then when the quota system all changed, what was so fascinating about the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, what it said, wait, so now the rest of the world can come. It used to be that it was mostly Europeans. Then it said, we're going to welcome everybody that wants to come here for work or have family ties, right? That's what they thought America was going to be about. And now I think it's high time for us.
It's also about Cold War politics and many other things.
Yes,
right.
exactly. But now I think it's time for us, now in this globalized, connected 21st century, I think we need to ask harder questions about what kind of policy do we really want and what kind of laws do we really want. I don't think we've gotten there. I don't think the Congress has gotten there. And as a society, when I step, in Alabama and they still are wondering what the Philippines is, or like they wonder why I look so Asian and my name is Latino, like it's kind of hard, man. Like we're not there yet. And I'm trying to, I guess, and I'm just one person, I am trying to, and a lot of other undocumented people are doing this, to raise the stakes of the conversation and to kind of shift it and make it about why people are here to begin with, right? One of the things that I really had to kind of learn from the beginning, when I was younger, before I even did this, is I had no control what people call me or what people think and what judgments they make, right? In some ways, what people choose to call me actually says more about them than it does about me. So certainly in the past 3 years, that's been like a very important thing for me to kind of hold on to.
So, Jose, tell me, do you fear being deported?
I spent all of my teen years and my 20s being scared. So I think after I did this, that's been probably the most liberating thing, is to not fear that anymore. The irony being, I think in many ways, it seems that, I used to be so scared of my government, and now my government doesn't know what to do with me. I think that's, to me, has been really interesting.
Thanks very much.